All right, welcome to the first of several lectures on American Indian sovereignty, law, and policy pre-contact to 1887. This is a time lapse of the land loss over time of the indigenous tribes of the United States to the present day. This is something that you can find online. But basically, it just shows how over the course of time, we saw westward expansion over what is now the United States. It really is a story about the concept of colonialism. And so colonialism is the subjugation of one group by another group. And it's usually in the form of settling on other people's lands and then taking over those lands. And so the experience of colonization involves different types of subjugation of people. And so in the history of the United States and settlement and colonization, there was a strong military component to that. And this happened with not just the English, but in the Southwest, the first Europeans that arrived were the Spanish. And so the conquistadors were in Mexico and New Mexico by the late 1500s. And so you can see some examples of the subjugation that occurred against tribal groups that we don't necessarily learn about a lot in our history books. This is one form of colonial subjugation that occurred. And then the religious subjugation. So, along with the Spanish came the Catholic Church and the missionaries. And this is an example of the mission system in northern Mexico and southern Arizona. So, you can see over the course of about 200 years, the missions began to slowly creep into southern Arizona. And they were established in order to convert the tribes of the area and to teach them how to farm, when in actuality, the tribes had already been farming, they knew how to farm. And during this early period in Arizona and northern Mexico, there were large-scale rebellions, and you did learn about the Pueblo Revolt as well. So they weren't always treated with dignity and human rights, and so when that occurred, the tribes would rebel. And then we have environmental subjugation. This is an example here in the Phoenix metropolitan area. So when the Spanish first came to this area along central to south central Arizona, along the Gila River, they encountered the tribes there that were already farming and had a pretty robust economic system in place. And so that area had some contact, but not as much contact with the Spanish and the missionaries that occurred in southern Arizona. But after the Mexican-American War, the Gila River was actually the border of Mexico until 1854. The Gadsden purchased all of southern Arizona. And then shortly after that, 5 years later, the Gila River Indian Reservation was established. And so, like I said, had already established a robust economy. And they actually, when the settlers came into the Phoenix area, when they're heading out west to California for the gold rush, they would resupply in Phoenix, and the Gila River Indian community would resupply a lot of the passersby and also provide them military protection from tribes such as the Apaches. And so when we look at what happened with the Gila River tribes is that the water began to be diverted upstream. And so you can see they went from self-sufficiency to dependency. And they started to receive many more pounds of wheat because they couldn't sustain their own food systems anymore. And it took over 100 years for them to get their water rights back. And the tribal leadership at the time, would appeal to the federal government to allow them to have water and to stop the people upstream from diverting the dam. Well, if we fast forward now in this current time, the community has a very high rate of diabetes, and we can point back to the environmental subjugation that changed the way of life of the people, changed their diet, and so had a real profound impact that's still felt to this day. And then cultural subjugation. Many of you may be familiar with the boarding schools and the concept of kill the Indian and save the man. But basically, what had occurred was that children were taken from their homes and sent into boarding schools for often for most of their childhood. And they were made to cut their hair, destroy their clothes. They couldn't speak their own tribal languages, and they're actually punished for doing so. And so this really had a profound impact on the tribes and the people, that many people kind of point to that today to explain some of the things um, that have, you know, compounded with in terms of, removing children and um, changing who they are. So when they come back to the community, they feel alienated. They weren't nurtured. They didn't have the bonding that um, children in the community would have had. So they then became parents. And so it started this cycle, and the familial structure was really devastated by the boarding school era. And it's something that should be acknowledged more in the history books that we have. But cultural subjugation has been a real tool for colonization of the United States and subjugation of the American Indian people. So we'll go ahead and end there, and we'll talk a little bit more about tribal sovereignty on the next lecture.